purpose of our chat today is to talk about what it means to be a mandatory reporter. This is probably one of the most challenging times for a new teacher and even a veteran teacher, because when the time comes that a teacher has to consider making a report, that's the time that a child is in distress, or a teacher is considering whether a child is in distress. And that's always a heartbreaking situation. It is also a stressful time for a teacher, because the teacher is thinking, is that really the situation, and am I qualified to make that determination? So I want to visit with you for a few minutes about what it means to be a mandatory reporter, what are the ethical and the legal requirements for a mandatory reporter. And first, let me say that when we talk about your being a mandatory reporter, that means that you are legally required to report a suspicion of abuse. It does not mean that you are required to investigate that abuse or that you are certain that it has happened. And I think that is a very important distinction for you as a teacher to remember. But let there be no doubt, you are required to report if you have a suspicion that a child has been harmed or potentially could be harmed. If you do not report, the ramifications of that are very severe. Number one, a child could be harmed. That is tragic. Number two, the fine, the potential jail sentence, and loss of your teaching license could also happen. And I'm very sad to report, happen every semester and every year, right here in Kansas. So it is important that you realize the ethical and legal responsibility of being a mandatory reporter, and make sure that you're up to that responsibility. Being aware of the children that are placed in your responsibility is important. Knowing the signs to look for, recognizing changing patterns with children. And again, let me stress that sometimes those changes in patterns, bruises even, broken bones, things that you have studied in your coursework that could be signs of, for example, physical abuse, might not be at all a determinant of physical abuse. Other things can happen. Developmentally, things can cause the same signs as physical abuse. Cultural things can also present the same symptoms as physical abuse. That is not your call. But to be aware, be cognizant, to use the professional term of withedness in your classroom, to listen to students and to refer when you believe that there is a cause for concern of a change in behavioral patterns, for example, with a child. When a child begins to act out and that has not been the child's previous pattern of behavior. I often have teachers ask me the chain of command. If they report a suspicious behavior to the principal, for example, and the principal says, "Oh, don't worry about that," or "I'll make that call," does that mean that the teacher doesn't have to follow up or doesn't have to worry about calling the Division of Child and Family Services? And the answer to that question is, that does not take the responsibility away from the teacher. The teacher is still responsible for being a mandatory reporter. Reporting a a concern to a principal or a counselor or a social worker does not take away the responsibility that the teacher has. I strongly recommend that you, number one, know your school policy and communicate and collaborate with the other professionals in your building, because it might be that others have already made the call or are working with the Division of Child and Family Services on a case that you might not be aware of. However, making sure that there is follow-up on a case is very important. And as a teacher, you want to document your actions, how you reacted, what you did, the steps that you followed to address the situation with a child. That is your proof, that's your evidence that you were ethically and legally responsible. You were not negligent in addressing a concern that you had about the welfare of a child. The whole purpose behind being a mandatory reporter is to protect children. And the other thing that I think is so very important, sometimes we have a mindset that only certain children are at risk of being abused. Please understand that all children are at risk of being abused. Sadly, any child is at risk of being abused by a family member, by someone that is in charge of their welfare, a child care worker, a pastor, a scout leader, any number of people. So all children are at risk. And we must, as educators, we must do everything in our power to protect children from being harmed. And sometimes that means being a mandatory reporter. Thank you for being a wonderful educator and protecting children to every degree possible.